big truths come along once a century, and odds are pretty good that I'm not going to be around for any of them, especially not at my age. But if I was living my entire life waiting for the big truth to come along, I'd be disappointed. The fact is, though, that big truths, when you read the history of science, and when you get to be my age, you start doing more history because we lived through the history. I'll read what people said was going on in the 70s, and I'll say, yeah, I was there. It wasn't quite like that, which tells you a little bit about history. What you discover is that people often only recognize the big truth in retrospect. It's only after you've been living with an idea for a while that you discover, oh, wait a minute. That's an idea that was a commonplace to me, but nobody else had noticed it. And I just kind of assumed everybody knew that. You find that big truths only work when there's a context to fit them in, when there's lots of little truths that can be organized and made sense of in light of the big truth. And so the big truth is pointless without the little truths.
And welcome to another installment of Behind Greatness by Inspire. It is Luciano here speaking as your host. Before we get into our next discussion, I want to remind the listener, as I always do, to please subscribe and share with your family and friends. That is the way we are growing, and that is the way we're going to continue growing. And thank you to those who have been sharing regularly. Because we are a charity as well, so if you feel inclined to help out, you can just go to our website, behindgreatness.org, and you can see where you can donate. Again, we're not-for-profit, as most of our listeners know, and also a charity. If you want to help us with our cause, and our cause literally is to figure out what the rest of the world knows that we don't, which is a lot, which means that we're going to be here a while. But it has afforded us time with a lot of people around the world, again, as our listeners know, to have fascinating conversations about almost everything, including human existence, death, creativity, imagination. And I hate to say science because science is just such a broad term, but we're going to hopefully talk about most of what I just mentioned here with our next guest. So our guest today joins us from the Vatican. His name is Brother Guy Consolmagno. He is the director of the Specola Vaticana, which is the Vatican Observatory. And he is the president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation. He's a native of Detroit, Michigan, where he had an undergraduate, or he received his undergraduate, and he received his master's degree from MIT and PhD in planetary science from the University of Arizona. He served in a Peace Corps in Kenya. He also taught physics at Lafayette College before entering the Jesuit order in 1989. He has been at the Vatican Observatory in Arizona since 1993. He's had over 200 scientific publications. He's the author of a number of popular books, including Turn Left at Orion and Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? He's also hosted science programs for the BBC Radio 4, been interviewed in numerous documentary films, appeared on a Colbert Report, and for nearly 20 years has written a monthly science column for the British Catholic magazine. His work has taken him to every continent. In 1996, he spent 6 weeks collecting meteorites with a NASA team on the blue ice region of East Antarctica. And he's had many, many other accolades, including in 2014, where he received the Carl Sagan Medal from the American Astronomical Society Division for Planetary Sciences for excellence in public communication in planetary sciences. Welcome to the show, Brother Guy.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is awesome. I told you that we came across your name a couple of years ago. When I say we, me and my boys, I forget what the base of the conversation was, but it was an exploratory one. We were talking about space and so forth. And then we came across an article where you were interviewed by somebody at Vox. I said, wow, he's saying some interesting things. And so we finally had the confidence to reach out to you, because we've been having really, really cool conversations with other folks, including an astronomer, as you know already, on the podcast, Avi Loeb. We said, okay, we want Brother Guy here to come on, and grateful to have you on. So again, thank you. So let's get right into it. Watching a TED Talk that you gave a number of years ago, and you start off by saying, I'm a fanatic and a nerd. Go.
Right. I am. I'm a fanatic when it comes to my science. I am just really passionate about science and being a scientist and what being a scientist means. And I'm something of a nerd when it comes to the church and, the mechanics of how it works and why we've got churches when, instead of just reading books and figuring things out on our own. Because I see this parallel between the two, that both science and religion are things that we do as individuals. It's me in front of the computer screen. It's me, kneeling in the church. It's me talking to God. It's me exploring whatever rock is in front of me. But I do it in the context of a bigger society, that I wouldn't know if there was a rock to be studied and what people have already done and what's going to be interesting for the rest of the community if I wasn't already part of the community. It's one of the reasons you go to graduate school rather than teaching yourself. You get to know the other people in the community. You get to know what are the questions that are interesting. You get to know where the conversation is. And the same thing is true in religion, that I only know that there is, a God to study because I've heard the history of how God has interacted with us human beings in history. I know techniques that work and traps to avoid because I've got this organized set of knowledge behind me that I can draw on as I then go ahead in my own personal pursuit of, trying to find God or trying to find the truth inside of a rock. The important thing to me is the conversation. I remember when I was a kid growing up in the shores of Lake Huron in the summertime, and the grown-ups would be all sitting around a fire and chatting about everything under the sun, and us kids would be hiding under the table, hoping they wouldn't notice us and, send us off to bed. And that's how I saw conversations, which part of it was knowing the context, because we kids couldn't figure out what they were talking about because we weren't old enough. Knowing what had already been said so you don't repeat yourself. And then realizing when you've got something to say, here is how I wait for the pause and insert what I have to say, because it's this social activity of human beings. Religion is not about finding God. It's learning how we and all other people have found God. Science isn't studying, astronomy isn't the study of stars and planets. It's the study of what human beings have learned so far about stars and planets. Both of them are these human activities. And you can't divorce it from the other people, or else you're just talking to yourself.
Yeah, you said that astronomy is the perfect gateway drug. Want to elaborate?
There's a lot of fantastic science. And an awful lot of it, you've got to be pretty advanced before you can appreciate it. Just as, if you're playing the piano, there are a lot of really complicated pieces. But there are certain pieces that a beginning piano player will always learn because they're fun pieces and they're relatively easy to play. Beethoven's Fair Louise is just, every student learns that one pretty early on because it's beautiful, but it's also simple. Astronomy is that introduction to doing science. Anyone with eyes can go out and look at the sky and be amazed and start to wonder. And even if you don't, have a good vision, there's an awful lot of astronomers with glasses like me, and even, astronomers who are blind, but they are able to hear about what's out there and to think about it and in some ways picture it in their heads. And everybody's got their own different way of picturing it. We can compare our stories that way. But astronomy is fun at every level. It's fun just to look at the sky and go, wow. And frankly, when I go out at night, I still do that. It's fun to then recognize the constellations and to know the stories of our ancestors, whether they're the Greeks and the Romans or, our ancestors in indigenous peoples. We've all got stories, and it's great to learn those stories because we then can connect the stories that different cultures have. and how they've understood the stars. And what science, what astronomy gives us is a technical story, a physics story that has something important to add to what we're looking at and why we're looking at it. But however far you are along in your own knowledge, there's a place for you where you can insert yourself into astronomy and learning the story of the sky.
How do you see the stars?
I see them in lots of different levels. Right now, we're recording this in December of 2022. I go outside and I look up and I see Mars really bright. And I go, oh, I remember when. So you see, I go out and I first see a bunch of bright stars. And then I see a red star that doesn't fit. And I say, that must be Mars. And then I start remembering what I've learned about Mars and how I have seen Mars in other times and other seasons, brighter or dimmer. And then I also remember being a graduate student when the first lander landed on Mars. You know, that was 1976, and Viking landed on Mars. And I remember the excitement in my department as people were seeing Mars for the first time. And I remember talking to friends of mine who are in the Mars business, who are telling me what are the exciting things happening on Mars now. So it's all of these different levels. There's first the amazement of just how pretty it is to see in the sky. There's the memory of when I first learned about that stuff. There's what I'm learning now. All of these things together.
You left science for a while. Why?
So you
were an MIT grad, excuse me, and you went to Kenya. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was in science for the wrong reasons. Just like, I meet people who say they're atheists. And when they tell me about the God they believe in, I realize I don't believe in that God either. You're good to be an atheist if that's what you think God is. I was in science for the wrong reasons. I was in it for myself. I was in it to make a name for myself. I was in it to get a pat in the head from my advisor. I was in it to get grant money and a big job and, exciting people who would have me on podcasts to talk about astronomy. That's why I was doing it. I actually, have chances to be on podcasts now, but that isn't why I do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I had forgotten why I did it. And I learned that from the people I met in Kenya, because they wanted to know about the stars. They wanted to know what the latest, results from NASA were. And it wasn't because they were going to get a grant for it. It wasn't because they were going to go on to graduate school with it. They wanted to know just because it was interesting. And they wanted to know just to see how the pieces fit together and how much fun it is to recognize that. Because for them, as for me, it feeds your soul. We don't live by bread alone. I'd read that someplace. And that made me go back to astronomy with a completely different mindset. I wouldn't be discouraged if people weren't quoting my papers because the number of citations to my papers wasn't why I was writing the papers. The fact that anyone was reading the papers and the ideas were out there and I was able to contribute, that was reward enough. Even if I didn't get credit for it. Doesn't matter if you get credit for it. Not if your goal is to have fun and to spread the ideas. I could only do that, of course, as a Jesuit where I'm not worried about getting a job. I can understand the people who need the citations to be able to get the tenure, to be able to get the job. But I was out of that, thank heavens.
Coming from a guy who directly reports to the Pope.
Yeah, I've got a privileged place.
Yeah.
But so here's the point. Even if you're in a job where you need the citations and you need to show people, that can't be why you're doing it.
Yeah.
The reward to doing science well is to be able to get to do more science. So doing the science itself better be the reward in itself. It better be the joy you get when you learn something new and the joy you get when you share that with other people, your students, your friends, your colleagues, whoever is going to read your paper and copy your ideas from you.
It's a common theme that we're getting from many of the scientists, all kinds of different scientists that we've had on the podcast, is that there is a joy in exploring something that they don't understand, which is, I would say that it's a childish endeavor, right? It's one that all of us know.
It's a childlike endeavor.
Childlike.
Absolutely.
Yes, childlike.
Here I am, in a library, and there's a bunch of books behind me, and these are real books. This is not just something that I can go and pick up the book.
Oh, I thought they were plastic.
It's
kidding.
it's not a photo behind me.
Yeah.
Here's the point. Science is not having memorized what's in all of those books. Each of those books are pretty old. Virtually everything in them is obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
We keep them on the shelves, mostly to remind ourselves where the story came from. And every now and then, it's wonderful to be able to see, oh, here's what we knew in 1823, and here's what we know today. And it's not all that different. They were onto something. Only they didn't realize it, and it took us a long time before we realized it. But it's to be able to be part of the conversation. But a lot of people learn science in school as memorizing stuff out of the book, getting the answers in the back of the book. That's not science. If that was science, that'd be the most boring thing in the world. But go back to my example of learning music. You learn to play scales before you can play music. You learn to play pieces that are written as notes before you learn how to interpret those pieces and make them your own, and to play them in a way that no one else has played before, because it's got your expression in it. There's a long way from playing scales to being able to do that, to discover new things in a piece of music. But that's exactly what happens in science. We train people by, making them do exercises, making them do finger exercises. But that's so that they can get into the habit of what science feels like, so they can have this muscle memory to then go and explore something new and come up with a new interpretation of the same rocks that have been in front of all of us all along.
We had a psychiatrist just recently on Dr. Jeffrey Rediger, and he did a master's in divinity before he went to med school. So when he got to med school, his educational training was the opposite of what he was starting to be trained in. So his professors trained him in focusing on the problem sets and figuring them out, rather than asking the open-ended questions. But he married the both. He was able to make, so we had a nice, I think, a fruitful discussion around both kinds of approaches to learning and exploring. There is one thing that you said when we chatted last, is you're not so interested in finding the big truths and the answers to the universe, but it's the spark of joy in finding out the tiny truths every day that drives you.
Big truths come along once a century, and odds are pretty good that I'm not going to be around for any of them, especially not at my age. But if I was living my entire life waiting for the big truth to come along, I'd be disappointed. The fact is, though, that big truths, when you read the history of science, and when you get to be my age, you start doing more history because we lived through the history. I'll read what people said was going on in the 70s, and I'll say, yeah, I was there. It wasn't quite like that, which tells you a little bit about history. What you discover is that people often only recognize the big truth in retrospect. It's only after you've been living with an idea for a while that you discover, oh, wait a minute. That's an idea that was a commonplace to me, but nobody else had noticed it. And I just kind of assumed everybody knew that. You find that big truths only work when there's a context to fit them in, when there's lots of little truths that can be organized and made sense of in light of the big truth. And so the big truth is pointless without the little truths. It's one thing to have the vision of a grand cathedral, but somebody's got to make the bricks, and somebody's got to stack the bricks one on top of the other, or else the cathedral is nothing more than a dream that passes in the night and is forgotten the next day.
This rings very loudly with me now, because I'm reading a book that I read 30 years ago that now my younger boy is reading. It's called Famous Last Words, Timothy Finley. And then he's reading another book for comparison that is an alternative history to American history during World War II. And there was something that Timothy Finley said. He's a fabulous writer. Not science fiction, because I know you like science fiction, but historical fiction. But there was a beautiful little line in there that stuck with me. And it's a line about history. and that history is actually made in the electric moment. And then we lose that electricity for readers of history because we weren't there. We weren't there for that little discovery. We weren't there for that little epiphany. We weren't there. We weren't there. We weren't there. So we lose contact with that spark, with that electric spark. But I can understand now when you talk about the big truths need to have a context with the little truths. It's the little sparks, the little electric moments that you might live every day when you find a little truth that can build.
Not only that, that's what gets you to go to the lab every day.
Right.
Because, if there was no payoff day by day and moment by moment, there's an awful lot of tedium that goes into doing science. And there had better be little sparks that make it all worthwhile.
Why become a Jesuit? Why did you?
It turned out to be the place and the society and the context for my life that fit me very well. And it took me a long time to figure that out. I had known of the Jesuits from when I was in high school in Detroit, and I admired them. I had thought of joining them at age 18, but I realized I didn't have the call to be a priest. I didn't have the tools. Priests deal with people with problems, and I'm not particularly good. I'm a nerd. I don't really have that range of understanding to be able to say, I can hear you. I know what you're going through. I know what is, what's the right thing for me to say, and more importantly, the right thing for me not to say. And instead, especially at age 18, when I would hear somebody talk to me, I think, well, of course you've got problems. You're an idiot. What do you expect? Which I'm told is not good pastoral care.
No, but that's the inner voice of every teenager to their parents. Go.
Exactly. Or in my case, not just my parents, but my friends, my fellow teenagers.
Sure.
Sure. I was a very, very hedonistic, self-centered kid in this sense that everybody else is drinking booze for the first time. And I said, this stuff tastes terrible. Why am I doing this? Just because everybody else is? Well, they're all nuts. I'd rather spend that money on chocolate. Or people, doing drugs instead of studying. And I say, I don't want to do drugs. I want to study. I want to know everything. Get out of my way. This is, getting in my way. It's not doing what I wanted to do. Mm-hmm. It's just that what I wanted to do was different from what everybody else wanted to do, I guess. I don't regret it. But I was nearly 40 by the time I actually entered the Society of Jesus. And the first point is I would always been religious from my earliest memories. And my religion was never a fanatical religion. It was never a religion of fear. It was never a religion of follow the rules or else. That wasn't how I was taught. That wasn't how I saw my parents live it. That wasn't how I saw, the nuns in my Catholic grade school live it. So when people talk about experiencing a religion like that, again, that's something I can't relate to. It's like, what are you talking about? I never heard that. But I guess other people did. I'm sorry. And, if that's the religion you reject, good, because that's a religion worth rejecting. I don't believe in all religions. I just believe in the one I'm in. Mm-hmm. The second thing was 20 years of trying to date and, going out and trying. The rule is that by the time you're 30, you should have a wife and 2.4 kids and a house in the suburbs and a Volvo out front and a dog and a cat. And that just wasn't happening to me. And every time it threatened to happen, I realized that's actually not what I wanted. Just like, my friends who were in a hurry to grow up when they were 18, I wasn't in a hurry for that. By the time I was 40, I realized I enjoyed the company of all of my friends who were women, but Lord knows I wouldn't want them to be married to me. What a terrible thing to do to them. And so a life of celibacy was actually much more in line with what I was looking for in my life. Because, the love is wonderful when it works and, the worst thing going when it doesn't. And that wasn't the way I was put together, and I even, envied my gay friends because at least they knew what was going on. That wasn't the problem with me. So what was it? I was looking for something different from what they were looking for, or rather I was looking for the same thing they were looking for, I think, but in a different way. Mm-hmm. What I did have was this strong religious sense of God's presence, especially in the sacraments, especially in the religion I'd been brought up in. It was a source both of comfort and of challenge. You know, my religion keeps me sane and drives me crazy. And we need to have both in our lives.
Why does it drive me crazy?
Because it challenges me to go beyond my comfortable where I am now. Oh, things are pretty set now. I've got, a good life. I'm when I joined the Jesuits, I was able to join a society of people who could accept me for being a nerd, because we're all nerds in this bus. It got me a chance to be able to live the sacraments because I'm in a community of priests who provide the sacraments for me, which I really love. Somebody once asked me, if you're a Jesuit, does that mean you have to go to church every day? And I said, if you're married, does that mean you have to have sex with your wife every day? It's one of the reasons you do it. It's one of the attractions. It's one of the pluses.
There are varied answers to that, depending on who you ask.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
Sure.
And, and if the answers are, that's one of the things I dread, then maybe you're in the wrong business in either case. And that's okay, because we're not all put together the same way. When I was thinking of becoming a Jesuit, I would ask my friends, including the women I had dated, and they were all unanimous that, yeah, we know you, we know the Jesuits, even the ones who didn't believe in God. They said, of course, this is you, this is where you fit, this is where you belong. And when I did enter, after a couple of years of thinking about it and praying about it and talking to lots of people, including lots of Jesuits, I had this sense of, yeah, this is it, this is right. I can only imagine that's what it's like when a married couple finally get together and realize, okay, yeah, this is what we were supposed to be all along. It was that kind of commitment to me.
You reminded me when we first spoke that they ask you three things: poverty, chastity, and obedience, and you have problems with one of those.
Yeah, and it's obedience, of course, because poverty, I was raised pretty well off. I'm used to having things. I don't have this hunger to have things because I've been there, done that. Chastity, as I say, I had 20 years of dating, and I know what it could be like when it was great. I also knew what it could be like when it was terrible. And I realized I'm not one of those people that's massively important. But obedience, in that sense, who I am, and I get to decide and I get to choose, that's something I still struggle with. That's something that's, that drives me crazy in a way that's important. Because, in my experience in life, most of the time when I fight to get my own way, I discover in the long run, I was wrong. As something as simple as when I was in graduate school, every class that was a requirement, but I was able to talk my way out of, I regret not having taken.
What does obedience mean for a scientist?
Quite specifically, for a Jesuit scientist, it means that being science isn't your number one priority. And if my superior tells me tomorrow to move to the inner city and serve soup at a soup kitchen, that's what I'll do. And that's very liberating because it means that the desire to do science isn't a handle that anybody has on me. They try to grab me by that handle and the handle breaks off. It's also not all that different from, non-Jesuit scientists I know who at some point may have to choose. Do I continue in the scientific job I've got now, or do I move to Texas with my spouse? Everybody has to make those choices. And it also is a choice, even if you're a single person. Do I do the science that they'll pay me to do, or do I do the science that I really want to do? And there's no easy answer to that, because if you're not getting paid, you don't get to do the science. So obedience, we're all under obedience in one sense or another. We're obeying the circumstances that we're in, the community that we're a part of. It may be that I'm really good at making widgets, and I'd much rather be a theorist, but my theories don't hold together very well. And meanwhile, the world really needs my widgets.
Let's change it up just a little bit, because I want to ask you about your Antarctica experience. And when I read it, I saw Eastern Antarctica. And I said, wow, I didn't know there was East and West Antarctica. That's really ignorant of me to assume that there wasn't. So I checked it up and I got even more confused. Why I didn't even know the geography of
Yeah, how do you
Antarctica.
describe something east and west when you're at the South Pole, right?
Right. But we've had two other people here. It's actually three other people on the podcast who have been in Antarctica. One of them was there for a side job so that she could do her art while there. Her name is Natalie Sudman. And then two other scientists, or a technician and a scientist, both of them early on in the podcast, Christiane and Max Katakila. And Max I just spoke to him. He's my wife's cousin. Just spoke to him, and he came back from his second tour in Antarctica, leading a team of 12 scientists for the European Space Agency. And he spent a year both times in Antarctica. It's fascinating for me. I mean, I would never do it. I don't think I have the courage to do it. I know the time, but it's mostly the courage. But he told me a few stories. He told me, it related to me, a few stories of Antarctica. Back to you. Because I want to see if I can relate any of them, depending on what you tell me. What were you doing there and why?
It was a bit different from the people who spend a year there, because it maybe in some ways made it harder knowing that the end was in sight, rather than just getting your head bent around to the fact that I'm going to be here for a long time. Don't even think about it. We were there for 2 months. And the first week was simply getting prepared to go out on the ice. And the last week was cleaning up afterwards. So we were actually on the ice for 6 weeks. Instead of living in, a semi-permanent building, which is what the people who winter over do, we were in tents. We were just in the same sort of tent that they'd been using 100 years earlier.
Wow.
That, there's a big triangle. It's got a couple of layers. So there's a little bit of insulation, a gas burning stove, white gas in this case, to keep it warm part of the time. It was very, very hard living.
Were you near the coast? Sorry.
And we were nowhere near the coast. When I say
Okay.
Antarctica, I meant we were on the plateau. So we were at 6,000 feet.
Wow.
Which is 2,000 meters for people who think in meters.
Mm-hmm.
We were quite a high elevation. And there was no vegetation. There was no wildlife. There were no penguins. There was one day in the 6 weeks when one of these ugly birds called a skua sort of flew overhead, and we're looking at it, and boy, is he nuts, because there's no food for a couple of 100 kilometers in any direction. And I hope we got back safe. There's nothing to eat. It is marvelous desolation. It is as much as I could imagine being on another planet, because all of the things that you used to are gone. And all of the things that you grew up being used to being able to do, you might not be able to. Just as an example, the ground is white. Everything's made of ice. There are flat areas that are blue where we look for the meteorites, but once you leave the flat areas, it's not just snow, but it's snow that comes in ridges called sastrugi. It's a Russian word, I think. And you've got to be careful, stepping across them, because they're little ridges. They're maybe a foot high. They're just the right height to trip you. When it's cloudy, the light becomes diffuse. You can't see the horizon because the sky is the same color as the ground.
Incredible.
And you can't see shadows. So you can't see the hills. And you are in a situation where your feet are on the ground, and you have to walk over maybe to that yellow tent over there. But I have to walk very carefully because I can't see the bumps in the hills. It's all the same color and all the same illumination. It's, there are, people on LSD who go on trips, putting themselves in chambers that give you that. Well, I don't need to do that. I was living in it.
It's the closest thing to space. I think that's what you said, right?
Really the closest thing to space, except you don't trip over things when you're in space.
Right. Did you find meteorites?
We found 400 meteorites. We went to a region where we knew there were likely to be meteorites. And, we were there 25 years into the project, which has now been going something like close to 50 years now. And when we were there, we went to the blue ice regions because that's where the ice has flowed enough to gather the meteorites together. And then the snow has blown away and the ice, sublimes, it evaporates in essence and leaves the meteorites behind. So the meteorites get concentrated in those areas. So it's simply a matter of getting in your skidoo, the 6 of us, going in a line, crossing the blue ice until somebody sees a rock. And you stop and we all go there and gather it and then continue on our way.
Amazing. Would you go back?
I've learned to never say no. But I'm 70 years old and physically, I don't think I could handle it. I had a hard enough time at 45.
Right.
I don't think it would be safe for me to go back. That said, the guy who was our safety officer then is still going back and he's in his 70s. So if you know what you're doing and you keep in good shape, there's no reason not to.
You just find it hard to be obedient if you're asked.
The body is no longer obedient. Put it that way.
Of course. Why? I should have asked you this before, but why does let's get into this string too. Why does the Vatican have an observatory to begin with?
There's a practical reason and a deeper reason. The practical reason is to show the world that the church supports science. When it was founded back in 1891, it was also to show the world that the Vatican, the Holy See, was an independent country and not part of Italy. Mm-hmm. And we would take part in international programs where the Italians did one thing and the Vatican did a different thing because we're not Italy. But there's a deeper thing, I think, that goes back to that question of why do you look at the sky? Why is it that people in Africa look at the sky and ask those questions? And it goes to feeding the soul rather than just feeding the body. It's really important to feed hungry people. It's really important to support the poor. But you have to remember, why are we doing it? It's not to make the poor rich. Because, if the rich are the problem, we're just creating more problems by making them rich. That's not what we're doing it for. We're doing all the things we do so that we can, to put it in this way, to enjoy the Sabbath. The 6 days of work. The highlight of the creation story in Genesis chapter 1 was the creation of the Sabbath, the day when you can kick back and wonder about things more than just, where's my next meal coming from? And if you don't have a chance to do that, if you're always worried about where your next meal is coming from, then you can't be completely human. Then you're no more than, an ant scurrying around looking for the next grain of bread someplace. It is to encourage people to use the logic that we were given, the talents of science that we had, to explore the universe and see deeper than just, oh, wow, the stars are pretty, but rather to say, there's something more there happening. There's some truth deeper that I can learn. And that spark of joy of discovery is the same spark of joy that I get in a moment of prayer, because it's an encounter with the same God. From the beginning of time, God reveals himself in the things he's created. That's not me. That's St. Paul. That's out of his letter to the Romans. Mm-hmm. And that's why we do science. And the Vatican has a group of people doing science to remind the world that's why we do science. To remind my fellow scientists that we're doing it not to get tenure, not to get a grant, but for that spark of joy. And also, nowadays, to remind people that science is on our side. Science isn't the big enemy, like some people would have you say.
I had a small experience again this summer. I was in the countryside in Italy, and there were family members. We were eating over at their house, and one of them, he was on the podcast program too. His name is Denis Molan. He's from Paris, and he's a data scientist. And he had a telescope, and he talked to me about this telescope. So, yeah, let's look through it. I've never looked through a high-powered telescope before. Shame on me. So he set it up. It took a while to set up. And for the first time in my life, I'm 48 years old, I saw Saturn. And it was a short but profound experience. I felt very, very, very insignificant. And I can't believe I waited so long. So I can understand how studying the universe through a lens can be pretty powerful. It can be emotional. It can be moving, and I can understand better, I think, at a very base level, how astronomers like you might get excited every day exploring the unknown out there, just because of that one little 2-3 minute experience.
I was just going to mention, looking at Saturn, I probably did that for the first time when I was 8 or 9 years old. My dad was the one who
Are you
taught
bragging
me.
now? You're bragging.
The point is that I saw Saturn through my little telescope, a few weeks ago. I still get the same burst of joy.
Nice.
It never grows old.
Nice. I believe you.
It's like saying, oh, I heard that song 10 years ago. I don't have to listen to it anymore. Oh, no. The more times you hear it, the more it sticks in your head and you can't get rid of it.
Yeah. Is it, again, maybe it's a silly philosophical question. Is it maybe you're talking about gateway drug, right? Are you addicted to the emotional experience of seeing something that is so far from you? And I mean that literally and also non-literally.
It's what we're made for. And it resounds in the things inside us that we live with ourselves every day of our lives. And we're still discovering things about ourselves. That's why, people want a shortcut. They want to get your DNA, or they want to know your astrological sign. No, the discovery of a spouse, the discovery of a friend, the discovery of yourself. I'm reminded of a Hopkins poem, to a young girl. Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove and leaving? And at the end it goes, it's the blight you were born for. It is Margaret you mourn for. Well, I think the physical universe is the thing we are yearning to understand because we're yearning to understand ourselves.
Speaking of trying to understand ourselves and discover ourselves, why write a book entitled, Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial?
It started out as all the stupid questions people keep asking us. And geez, if we have one more book that has the answers, maybe they won't ask. But in the process of writing the book, I discovered, thanks especially to my co-author, who's a philosopher, that they're not stupid questions. They're just questions that don't have simple answers. And they're the kinds of questions, I had a philosopher tell me about two kinds of questions. There's the one, do I have enough money in my pocket to buy a candy bar? You look in your pocket, you find out yes or no, no longer an interesting question. The second is, what's the candy bar I want to buy? Why do I want that? What is it about chocolate that really appeals to me? These are questions you can go back to over and over again and maybe not get the same answer every time. The best science questions are the ones that you live with. And so we put 6 of those questions in the book, of which baptizing ET is one of them. And it's a great question, not because it's got an answer. It's a hypothetical. Mm-hmm. My dad taught me when, his time as a journalist, never answer a hypothetical question because, show me the extraterrestrial and then we'll decide. But when you ask the question, you're asking, what does it mean to be baptized? What does it mean to be, have gone through a rite that makes you a member of this society? Whether it's baptism or, you're the last dog to cross the busy highway without getting killed, and that makes you part of the club. What is it about us that we need to be part of the club? What are we looking for? What are we offering when we offer that to somebody else? Would I have an extraterrestrial baptize me? What kind of equality am I expecting, desiring, wondering? And these are questions with no answers necessarily, but to ponder them makes you appreciate more the fact that I did go through a thing called baptism. I have helped other people go through that. It does mean something, even if it's just, a splash of water and a couple of words. I have a piece of paper in a frame on my wall in my room in Tucson, the other place where we've got in the observatory, because we've got a telescope there as well as here.
Yep.
And that piece of paper is what I got in the mail in 1971 saying that I was admitted to MIT. Just a set of words on a piece of paper that changed my life. The power of words, the power of a rite of passage, the power that we have over ourselves and that we give to other people to say, yes, you will be a different person because we admitted you to this school. Well, you could have gone to that school and have been a really interesting person, just not the person you are. That's fascinating.
Well, I think what makes you a really interesting person, and I don't mean just you, although in this case, it also means just you, it also means you, is the questions that you allow yourself to ask. I mean,
Yeah.
so going back to that Vox article, I circled something that you said that I really appreciated, especially as a father, um, and someone who does not pretend to have any answers on anything. So they asked you again about extraterrestrials, and you said, um, "We don't know what we're really talking about. As long as we realize that it's fun to hypothesize, it's fun to have fun with the ideas." Uh, if you take that literally, so, oh, that's a kind of a lighthearted comment. I kind of like that. It's breezy. It's fun. No, you said ideas. Right? To have the ideas is the start. And that's what I appreciated from that.
And that sense of fun is a way of slipping in really that sense of joy. In other words, if you can find God in the ideas. But that sounds so ponderous and heavy that no one would want to do that. So instead, I say have fun with the ideas.
I don't know if it was in the same interview or not. You said nothing is ever proved. No, this is, I think, in your TED talk. You said nothing is ever proved. Science merely describes, it doesn't prove.
Yeah. I would say nothing is proved, but rather science doesn't prove. You can prove mathematical theorems. You can prove philosophical statements within the context of the assumptions that you made, just as the mathematical theorems are within the context of the axioms that go behind it. And so there is that sort of proof. But that's exactly what science doesn't do. Remember these books behind me, every one of them is obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
If there were books of mathematics, you could still do the math in them. If there were books of literature, the literature would still be as worth reading or as not worth reading as when it was written. Now, the meaning of the literature changes with time as we know more. The context of the math changes so that we appreciate Euclidean geometry because we put the word Euclidean in front of it because we now know there's also non-Euclidean geometries. And so that puts a different meaning on it. It doesn't make it false. But the paper that I wrote 5 years ago is probably not true. And certainly the textbook I wrote 20 years ago has got all sorts of things that I realized I was almost right, but not quite. And I've got a book with a co-author now about when science goes wrong and why we love it, which is the story of brilliant bits of science that advanced our scientific understanding of the universe precisely because they were wrong and we found out where they were wrong.
Last comment on one of the things that you told me in the last conversation when we talked about what the Jesuits don't want. So they don't want. You said two things. So number one is they don't want to accept people that are running away from something. And number two, this is really important for me to understand. They don't want people who are holding an agenda.
Yeah. That goes back to that obedience. That goes back to being able to do science, knowing that I get to do it now and it's great, but that's not the handle that can be used to jerk me around.
And we find that agenda in non-Jesuit terms, or maybe in Jesuit terms, I don't know, I can't speak to that, is often tied to ego.
Yep.
And rigidity of beliefs.
And you find fundamentalism.
Yes.
Exactly where you have this kind of ego where my self-identity is so tied up in this particular way of looking at the world, this particular picture of God, this particular picture of who I am. And that kind of rigidity is often rigid because we know deep down in our hearts it's not true. And we're afraid of being found out. I found there's two different kinds of that being found out, that imposter syndrome. Mm-hmm. There's the imposter syndrome where you go through life terrified because people are going to find out that you're a fake. Then there's the imposter syndrome where you go through delighted that I've been able to fool the world this long. Isn't this crazy? And when they do find out, we're going to have a great time laughing about it.
Oh, that's great. That's great. That's the kind of imposter I'd like to be.
I hope that's the kind of imposter I
am. Well, I'm convinced of it just by this conversation. So last question for it. What is greatness to you?
Greatness really is being comfortable with yourself, comfortable with where you are, being content. You asked before why I was a Jesuit. I was a happy person before I was a Jesuit, but I was only a content person in the Jesuits. It's, all I can do is come up with the same buzzwords other people use. It's being grounded. It's being, comfortable in your own skin. It's being able to laugh at yourself and just being able to laugh, period. And that shows itself in that you stop being judgmental. You stop being accusative. You stop, being upset when other people are faking it, because usually you hate in other people the things you hate in yourself. And so the less you hate in yourself, the more you can accept other people. Greatness builds on that foundation. You have to have that before you can do something original and new. And then the original and new happens to you. It's not something you created. I'm a big Bob Dylan fan, just to go back to my generation and the gray hair and the fact that I grew up in the 60s. And there's a Martin Scorsese documentary of Bob Dylan that ends towards the end, where he's interviewing the guy who produced the records, during that time when Dylan had like 3 fabulous records in 1965. And the producer, not Tom Williams, but the guy after him, whose name I'm blanking on. And now he's old and gray and he's sitting back and he goes, listen to that music. That's not Dylan. That's the Holy Spirit. And greatness is being so comfortable that you let the Holy Spirit have its way with you.
You said something in another interview that I took down. I wasn't going to say it, but then about halfway through our conversation, I realized, how can I not? Because your spirit shows this. And you were interviewed, and somebody, I forget the question that they asked you, but it was about it was a looking back question. I guess I'll end it off here. And you said, in my heart, I'm still a 12-year-old kid from Detroit. Yep. Your sense of exploration and your passion in talking about exploration, at least in this last hour, is very convincing. Brother Guy, thank you for your time. Wonderful, wonderful stuff.
And thank you for letting me be the 12-year-old kid that I hope I never stop being.
That's great. Childish or childlike, doesn't matter.
Both.
Thank you.
Hey, it's Enrico Colantoni here, actor, director, and dedicated napper. Like what you heard today, there's more to come. Make sure to subscribe to Behind Greatness and learn about our live events at inspirenorth.com. You'll also find links to our social media right on our website, so be sure to give us a like and follow. Until next time, stay inspired.